Everybody's had some adventures. Everybody's had a few close calls. Everybody's got a story. What's yours?
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 22 of Cool Story with David J. MacNeil. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate your continued support. This episode features a chat with author Greg Oliver, who I've known for about 18 years now. Back in 2003, Greg wrote a piece about a sketch character I was playing on a CBC after-school show. Bad Dog Tremblay was a French-Canadian wrestler that I had based on two of my favorite tag team wrestlers from Montreal known as the Vachon brothers. Paul, or Butcher Vachon, the youngest of the Vachon brothers, was a fan of the goofy sketches I was appearing in and suggested that Greg Oliver interview me for an upcoming article for Slam Wrestling. Based on that conversation between Greg and Butcher, on October the 28th of 2003, the article, A Bad Dog Aimed at Kids, was published. If you Google it, you can still find it. 18 years later, we've come full circle, and now I am chatting with Greg about his latest book about the legendary Canadian actor, writer, singer, songwriter, pitchman, and TV host, Billy Van. That book is titled, Who's the Man? Billy Van. I first became a massive fan of Billy Van's when I discovered the iconic cult classic kids show, The Hilarious House of Frightenstein, in the 1970s. What I didn't know was how many other big shows Billy had been a part of that I'd missed out on, or that I was reminded of as I read Greg's book. So, let's get right into it. Here is my conversation with Greg Oliver about the late, great Billy Van. Hello, Greg. How you doing, man?
I'm good, David. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you for being on the show. We've come full circle. I pulled up the article that you wrote about the character Bad Dog I did, and that was 17 years ago, so we've come full circle. Now I'm the interviewer, which is pretty cool.
It is kind of amazing when I look back. Like, I've been writing about professional wrestling for 35 years. So there's a lot of those occurrences. Like, even my old newsletter, I ended up hiring some of the kids who used to get my wrestling newsletter to work with me at canoe.ca, which was the Sun's website. So it's a wonderful world sometimes.
Yeah. That was a really cool experience, because if I remember how this went down, so at the time I had pitched this idea for a character. It ended up being on CBC. It was a wrestling character, comedic, a wrestling character based on the Vachon brothers, who you know very well, and you were especially good friends, I guess, with Butcher. And I had reached out to Butcher and to Mad Dog to say, I've done this sketch. If you see it, it's a homage to you. And I guess Butcher had got in touch with you and said, oh, this kid's doing this thing, and then you ended up interviewing me.
That sounds about right. It's funny. Like, I ended up lifelong friends with Butcher because he was in Toronto and the Expos happened to be playing the Blue Jays.
Yeah.
And I called in a favor, and not only did I score him tickets, but they put him on the Jumbotron. And so he just loved that. Like, old wrestlers still love being in the spotlight.
Yeah.
So that I talked to him a week or two ago. So
that's amazing.
He's still going.
Yeah. And where does he live? He lives down in the States, right?
No, he's actually right on the border, essentially, from Vermont and Quebec, but on the Quebec side.
Oh, okay.
So if there wasn't a border closed, they would be down there. He does Santa Claus every Christmas at a mall in on the other side in Vermont. But this year he had to do it virtually. So they're still out there, man. But your Bad Dog lives on too, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure you still get fan letters.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about that, but when I post stuff about it every once in a while, some of I get some nice posts back and stuff and comments about, it was a fun character and stuff. One of the really cool things about that too was that, Butcher's such a generous person that when we started shooting these things, I'd put on DVD and I'd send him copies, and then he'd send me like envelopes full of black and white and color photos and like old press stuff and you name it. I must have had like about 25 different photos of different eras of him and his brother and his sister, and it was pretty nice of him to do that. I had some of them framed and put up in my office, my various offices over the years too.
Cool.
Yeah. But let's get down to what we're going to be talking about today. And that is that you've been writing books for a long time. You've been writing about wrestling and hockey. You've written a couple of kids' books. So you've got 16 books in total. And your newest book is called Who's the Man? Billy Van. And it focuses on a great Canadian actor that we both know and love, that a lot of people of our generation mostly knew him from The Hilarious House of Frightenstein. But of course, he had a very expansive career. And that's what your book is about. So what drew you to Billy Van?
Well, I think as you said there, I mean, it was those of us of a certain age. We saw Billy Van on the Hilarious House of Frightenstein. We saw him on Party Game. And then you saw him pop up everywhere else. And it's like, oh, that's him on Kings of Kensington. That's him on Bizarre.
Mhm.
That's him here. He was a chameleon. He could really change it up. And he always had work. I guess that's the key. So there was that element to it, but it all ties into wrestling as it usually does. Rotten Reggie Love was an old wrestler, and he'd been on Bizarre often.
Right.
And that's a show that Billy Van was on. So I ended up talking to John Biner, who was the star of Bizarre,
Yeah.
about Rotten Reggie Love. And then that led me talking a little bit about Billy Van and how much I loved Billy Van. And John Biner shared some touching stories about how they kept in touch right to the end kind of thing. And so I knew there was something there. And around the same time, Stacey Case, who's my co-writer, he's an interesting character in and of himself, between running the Pillow Fighting League and his Trash Palace movies that he used to show in his workspace and all these other things he's done. On one time, we went down to the Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame together, which was about a 5-hour drive. So we had lots of time to talk. And we talked about Frightenstein and this and that. And he had gotten a copy of an unpublished memoir that Billy Van had written. So that was sort of the basis for me then applying for a grant to try to do it. And that was like a dozen years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So, it would just happen to be an Ontario Arts grant. You didn't have to actually report on it, but they certainly never gave me any for wrestling or hockey,
Mm-hmm.
but they gave me one for entertainment. So I did come through, in case anybody's out there listening. I finally came through. But yeah, he was just a fascinating character. And the more and more I dove into it, the more and more I wanted to know, because his memoir was just some of his select stories from acting.
Mhm.
It told you nothing about him as a person. It left out huge swaths of his career. Like, he didn't talk about his starring roles on CBC, where he was a star in various movies, or
Yeah.
I guess telenovels, or whatever we want to call them today.
Mhm.
So the guy was a leading man, but he didn't like doing that. He actually called that memoir Second Banana, because he didn't see himself as a leading man.
Right.
And I like to think that this book is changing the perception of him.
Yeah, and he's really, I mean, it was fascinating to read the book. First of all, it was a great book and I really enjoyed it. And there's a couple of things I loved about it. And, aside from just, the fact that it was Billy Van's story, one of them was it just reminded me of the lives of a lot of people I know. And much like probably your own life, working in the arts and being an artist and being a writer, is that you really have to hustle, and you've got to have a lot of gigs over the years, and you're always looking for the next thing. And it was interesting to watch his progression, because he goes from essentially a vaudeville artist, a singer. He sang in about 4 or 5 different groups that had varying degrees of popularity and success. I got to travel to Europe, and he worked on different albums and stuff. And then he had his own singing group, what do they call the Billy Van Four?
Yep.
That performed on all kinds of different shows and got to travel and played at, on different variety shows. And then he makes the move from there to acting and comedy and so on and so forth. He really runs the gamut of all the different sort of rungs on the ladder of success in the entertainment business in that era. And it's interesting too that it's just an era that's gone in forever. But it's interesting to read about how these people got those gigs back in the day. Like you talked about in the book about, like, we're just walking into audition at offices at the CBC or whatever.
Yeah. I really enjoyed studying some of that aspect and talking to those people, because I didn't like somebody like a Pam Hyatt worked continually kind of thing, but she didn't really overlap with Billy a lot, but she was able to really sort of explain that process, right? It was about who you knew, and that could have been the secretary, right? So the secretary says, hey, I just, the boss is starting to cast for this. You'd probably be right. So, but it was also such a small shop, right? CBC wasn't massive. Everybody went to the same bar.
Yeah.
And even just the fun part, just describing the bar and what was it like, it really rang home for the few people I've heard from that are in the book. And they're like the Grant Cowans or Jack Coopers that were on CBC back in the 50s and the 60s. It's like, I'm loving this book because I'm reliving my youth and I'm thinking about all these people that I haven't thought about in a long time.
Yeah.
And as a writer, I mean, that's a different kind of magic than hearing from a fan who loved Billy Van and Frightenstein. It means I'm hitting it on a couple of different levels. And I didn't really set out to do that, especially, but that's certainly how I helped fill in some of the gaps in Billy's story.
You talk in the book about his early influence, in particular. In the book, you talk about his influence and his peers' influence on future projects, and one of them is his work on Nightcap, which was an evening comedy show it was pretty risque at the time, or avant-garde, right?
CBC was not known for, letting their hair down kind of thing. They were really prim and proper. And somehow this CFTO Nightcap got approved, and it just grew exponentially from there. Essentially, it was Saturday Night Live, right? They ran news bits and had the newspapers out. They did comedy sketches. They had guest stars, all these different things put together into this crazy mix that was topical, right? So they could make fun of whatever scandal was going on, or make fun of like Juliet on CBC, which got them in huge trouble because you're not supposed to make fun of Juliet, but yet they did. And they were thumbing their nose at the establishment. And that to me is exactly what Saturday Night Live did too.
Yeah.
Of course, at U of T at the time was Lorne Michaels and Hart Pomerantz, who later became, their own writing partners and comedic act. But yeah, Nightcap was fabulous. And it's also an example of how going viral, I guess, is we can use today's term. I mean, it started in Toronto and then other stations started picking it up. Windsor wanted it, London. And it started getting sort of bicycled to all these different stations. And CBC was not known for doing that, right? They had like their couple of national programs and that was it. So it was really unique growth that it went through. And then, of course, some bureaucrat looks at it, goes, I don't understand this. It's gone.
Yeah. Yeah, but not forgotten. Like you mentioned in the book, you've got quotes from various other comedians who talk about, how it was definitely a precursor to, as you mentioned, SNL, but the Frantics in Canada and Kids in the Hall and a variety of other Canadian comedy shows that became massive elsewhere as well.
Exactly. It has to start somewhere, right? And one builds and the next and the next. Absolutely. I did reach out to all those guys, right? Air Farce and the Frantics, and they all kind of said, well, we didn't know Billy, but we certainly knew of him and he was an inspiration. So not a lot of those guys are really in there. Scott Thompson from Kids in the Hall is quoted just talking about, going home watching Frightenstein. Like he's around our age, right? So that's what we used to do.
Yeah. And let's talk about Frightenstein for a bit. I remember, I think I first saw it, I'm guessing in about 74 on the air. I'm pretty sure I first saw it when I was, my parents lived in Saskatchewan in Regina for 2 years. And I remember seeing it there. And then I remember coming back to Ontario and living in Ottawa and then seeing it on whoever picked it up there in Ottawa and watching it for a few years on and off. And I guess the thing I loved about it, and was one of the reasons I was inspired to get into kids television, is it was just like, you could tell that they were doing it on a shoestring budget, but wow, I mean, the stuff that they did with the money they had. And I think, what did they do? How many seasons in 9 months? Is it 5 seasons?
They did 130 episodes in 9 months.
That's just insane.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's impossible today. But yeah, it's an amazing story. And it's also one of those early examples of syndication, right? I mean, Riff Markowitz was the producer and he also did Party Game, and they do coincide. And that's important to note because he built up this little syndication empire and was able to send out the shows across the country. So Brent Butt from Corner Gas never saw Frightenstein, and he was in Saskatchewan growing up, but he saw Party Game. Right. So that's where he knew Billy Van from, and he knew him from Sonny and Cher. But Frightenstein was this little show that was filmed in Hamilton at CHCH over an intense 9-month period. But the crazy thing is that you can't think of it as they filmed the shows, because they didn't. They filmed the segments. So Billy was the Wolfman for 5-6 straight days. Yeah. And they filmed all those. And then, Billy was Griselda, and then Billy was the Oracle. And he was never even there when Vincent Price was there. He never met him until years later. So it was a really unique way to film a show too. So a lot of credit goes to obviously Riff Markowitz for coming up with the idea, but also the CHCH crew that, was hired to work on it. And they created some magic, including things like that feedback loop that they danced to, which was new technology. Yeah. It was sort of an accident. And we describe in detail, one of the CHCH guys detailed how that came together. So yeah, it was a it was a funny show because it was supposed to be educational too, and mainly we got laughs out of it. We didn't really realize, oh, the professor's trying to teach us something. Oh, Dr. Petvet's trying to teach us something.
Yeah.
Oh, Ooga Booga's trying to teach us something. Like you just Even Grammar Slammer.
Exactly.
Bammer was teaching us something.
Yeah, I remember there was it was education light, but there was definitely things that you could pick up and stuff, and then just your appreciation for music and all these different things, and they made all that stuff cool. When maybe some of it might not have been that cool for an audience of that age or whatever. And then they also has, as Billy kind of mentioned, when he was asked about that period of his life later, saying that it seemed like it was a lot of college kids tuning in. I think it was very much of a cult phenomenon, much maybe the way I think maybe Pee-wee's Playhouse might have been as well, where I think a lot of college kids, would roll one up and watch the hilarious House of Frightenstein. So a second audience.
A couple of years ago, we had a fundraising event for the book and for the museum. We had a short time. There was a Billy Van Museum in Hamilton, since closed, but we had a fundraiser and a couple of people were there, like Tom Wilson from Junk House and all his different bands, and Sue Foley, the blues musician, were there. And they both got up on stage and read out little bits from Billy's memoir, but they also talked about getting stoned and watching the show. So back when because they were a little bit older than us, but still it was fascinating. And there's some crazy stat that I found where crime in New York City actually went down when the show was on the air there, because, a lot of the drug fiends or whatever were watching the show instead of out creating trouble. So who knows? It's a great story. I hope it's true. I put it in the book.
All those Frightenstein fans who would have otherwise been out murdering people.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I just love that show growing up. And then reading the book, I used to work at TVO and people used to talk about Billy quite often. And then it wasn't until I read your book that I realized how many other shows he had done that I was aware of. And I just didn't know that it was Billy Van from, this other show I loved, whether it was Bits and Bytes or Bits and Bytes 2. He also did another show on fitness for people over 40. What was the show where he played the robot that taught, or the alien that taught people how to speak English?
It's just called How Do You Do? How Do You Do?
Right. That was another one. And then I started seeing all these photos in the book and I was like, I've seen that. I used to watch that. But and that was the thing about TVO is I've had other friends who've been on TVO. The beauty of that is that, at one point there was only about 2 or 3 channels that anybody got in Ontario, and that was one of them. So you knew those shows.
That's a big part of it. And that goes to the Retro Ontario website, right? That Ed Conroy runs. I mean, he was a big help in the book, just helping me source some of those legends, right? There's a couple of different shows that only just existed briefly in people's memory, and they were on the air once and gone. There's the TVO years, the educational years for Billy were wonderful. They kept him working. He got in really good with David Stansfield and Denise Boiteau, who hired him to do Bits and Bytes. Later Bits and Bytes 2, he did How Do You Do, where he was dressed up as a robot. The show that probably the most people know him from that's educational, and you may not even know it, is called Eureka.
Oh, right. And Eureka, yeah.
It was a physics cartoon. And he did the voice explaining whatever that thing was. He was explaining physics for over 30 years. Yeah. Like, it was insane. Like, probably more kids have seen that than probably anything but Sonny and Cher at the top of his game. And then he did, Fitness Over 40, and where he was, this guy sitting on his butt and trying to get out and exercise as he got older.
Or the Colt 45 ads.
Well, they were US, so they're not really on here. But
they're not on Retro.
But it's important to note that Colt 45 was Billy's biggest moneymaker in his entire life. He got in good with those people. He did that for like more than a dozen years. He didn't have to speak in any of the commercials. And yet he had this gig that ran for years and years, and the residuals, and it was probably the best thing he ever did. He got to be really great friends with the guy who ran it, and to the point that his daughter Tracy called him Uncle Bill. So and that's, but that you mentioned earlier about the hustle, right? You had to do the hustle. He'd done all that things when he was younger, doing all the spiels on the radio and doing all the jingles and all those things you have to do to fill in the blanks in your career and make a few bucks. And so he got really lucky with Colt 45, and it, like I said, it made him a ton of money.
In the book, you talked about how when he wrote his own book, but he never released it. You said it was called Second Banana. And did you know why it is that he left so much out? Was he conflicted about what was what he had done that was good and maybe not so much or good, or what people wanted to hear about, or what was that? I found that interesting that he really left so much out. First of all, he was very private. A lot of people didn't really know much about his private life. He didn't talk about that. He was more, when he was at work, he was professional, and he chatted about the business and what was going on at hand. But he wasn't a very open person about his own personal life.
For sure. That's one of the things that came up again and again when I was talking to, other celebrities, actors, directors, whoever was that worked with Billy at the time. They all talked about how much fun he was, how he could make everybody laugh, how he was very professional and got the job done. Mm-hmm. And then I would ask them, well, what do you know about him personally? And they would stop and go, not much. Mm-hmm. Some of them knew his daughter, Tracy, because she came to a few different things. But nobody knew about his first daughter, Robin. He was married 5 times. In that first high school relationship, they had a daughter right away. And Billy saw her like 2 or 3 times and then was out of her life until she was an adult. And then she came up to meet him as an adult and only met him once. So all those kind of things he left out. He was married, like I said, he was married 5 times, basically roughly 10 years of marriage. So I don't know, at some level, maybe he was embarrassed by that. But yet all the wives still kept in touch with him. Mm-hmm. All but Joan, who was in Florida, and his first wife, they all went to his funeral.
Yeah.
So it's not like anybody was peeing on his grave or anything. They all still got along with him. Now, I'm sure some of the money and residuals and stuff he had to share worked out okay. I couldn't get all those financial details. I sort of wish I could have, but some of the wives are gone. So that part's really interesting. But he was a really private guy, and I think in this memoir, he really wanted to set more of a lessons learned tone, because he also tried to help struggling actors. He had a book that helped people get, bookings and how to find talent agencies and things like that. And he ran a talent agency himself for a while. So he was deeply invested in the entertainment business. And I think he tried to be a bit of a mentor at the end, for good or for bad.
Yeah. When you write a book about somebody like Billy Van, do you feel protective about him, or you just kind of, whatever comes to you, whatever the story is, that ends up on the page? Or do you have to think about, because you wrote a chapter in the book called Billy the Good, Billy the Bad, I think it was called. And you kind of talk about, his life and then some of his difficulties and that sort of thing. When you write a chapter like that, do you get protectionist about the person you're writing about?
I'm not sure protectionist is quite the right word. You do feel like you know him more, like I never met him. At least Stacey Case, my co-writer, had met him. And you feel like you're inhabiting his circle a little bit. And you want to be more protective almost in some ways of the family that's still around.
Sure.
I made sure that both Tracy and Robin, his daughters, were okay with what was in there. And to that matter, he had a stepson from his third marriage, Jamie, who was the same age as Tracy. So they led sort of parallel lives for a little while, where, the divorced daughter comes over and hangs out with the step brother that she doesn't really get along with. And they still don't really get along. They're not buddies by any means. You do feel a little bit protective. But then the other end of the thing is that his last wife, Susan, didn't want any part of the book. She still feels so close to Billy, and even seeing Tracy will make her tear up, and she can't deal with it. So she didn't want to be a part of this book. And I think it would have added a little bit more about Billy, what Billy was like the last, decade of his life as things were fading, for sure. So there's frustration too. I guess not protectionist. It's like, I want to know more, and you always want to know more. And those little tidbits, like, what kind of booze he was drinking and hiding, the vodka, whatever it is, like those tidbits are gold to a writer.
Yeah.
And it was the same. The only other biography I've done like this is about Father Bauer. And he was a hockey coach and a priest. And so finding those little dirty tidbits was a lot harder with a guy like him, right?
Sure.
Occasionally the guys would tell me about he'd sneak a smoke, or he'd, he liked a little nip of vodka or cognac or whatever. So with Billy, though, there was a lot more warts and all, because a lot of people knew about his drinking. They all knew him down the bars and the beaches, part of Toronto. Those kind of things So a lot of it was already out there, but it was never all put together. And that's the biographer's job.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it was interesting, thinking that you were writing about him hanging out in some of the bars and the beach and stuff. And I lived out in that part of town around the end of his life. And I thought, wonder where he was hanging out. I might have run into him in the bar one night with friends when we were out at one of the pubs and not have recognized him.
That is one of those things that come up. So my brother-in-law was a comedian for a while. And he's been a big supporter of the book and of course a friend forever. But he posted it on his Facebook page and one of his friends said, "Oh yeah, I used to work at a bar. Billy was in there all the time." It's like, where were you when I was writing this book? But that's the natural part of these books too, is that you find out things after the fact that you wish you could have included. Yeah. And you just have to live with it. You can't let it eat at you.
Yeah. One of the other dynamics in the book is something that we talk about a lot about as Canadian performers, is that dance between, going to the U.S., what kind of success you can get down there. And maybe, there's so many Canadians. It used to be a thing that Canadians would go down. And I know so many young people who would go down to Los Angeles for pilot season. And they'd hang around for about a month and stay in a motel and go out and grind and try to get parts and stuff. And some people would, and where they work down there for a little bit and then come back or stay, or some people became, big stars in their own right. But that was always the dance that Canadian performers did, figuring out whether or not that was their place or not. And Billy did that. He was down there for quite a while and had a huge success working with Sonny and Cher on their show. But he was dismayed by that. He wasn't a fan of the Hollywood lifestyle, was he?
Those would probably be one of the questions I'd really ask him if I ever got a chance to go back in time, because there's a little bit of a mixed message. He tells some really fun stories in his memoir, but you wonder how true some of them are. Mm-hmm. And then on the other end is like, he does tell the story of getting mugged, and he was in a hotel room mugged at gunpoint.
Right. And
that really colored him about how Hollywood worked, how Los Angeles worked, how different it was than Canada. And yet that was early in his time in LA. So he then later brought his third wife down and her son, and they had a couple of different houses around California. So while the mugging certainly colored things for him, it didn't drive him out of town. Mm-hmm. What really drove him out of town was just that sheer hustle, right? Yeah. And the sheer volume of people, just like you described, right? You'd go to an audition and you'd see people who were successful actors on other shows trying out for these things, and you just sort of shrug and go, well, I probably don't have a chance of getting this gig.
Yeah.
Whereas in Toronto, he was a big fish in a little pond, and down there he was a little fish in the very, very big pond. But the success, like almost anything in life, is about who you know. Yeah. And Alan Bly certainly looked out for him a ton, who he knew from singing back in the 50s on CBC. And Alan Bly worked with Chris Beard. They did all kinds of things down there, including Sonny and Cher. So he had his guardian angels for sure down there in California.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because you mentioned that he, back home in Toronto or in Canada, he was constantly being stopped on the streets, and people wanted autographs and wanted to hear stories and that sort of thing. And you say in the book that didn't happen in Los Angeles because, like you said, he was he was a small fish in a massive pond in an ocean, but on the other hand, he was much more of a hands-on father when he lived in Los Angeles, because he did have more, he wasn't being engaged all the time from fans like he would be at home. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword in that regard as well.
Yeah. And that's why it would have been really neat to explore that with him and just understand what drove him back here. He came back to Toronto. He tried to run a talent agency. He tried to do some different other work, right? He ran little businesses on the side, which were fascinating in and of themselves. And, as a lot of life comes to luck too, doesn't it? I mean, I went down to talk to Jack Cooper, who somebody told me, he was on CBC in the 50s. And then I sit down with Jack and he goes, oh yeah, well, then I later became Billy's landlord. Well, what do you mean? Well, Billy's office was in the building I owned. So right. I would use them occasionally on commercials I was doing or whatever. So, as a writer, you need some luck sometimes too, to get those kind of stories and find the right people.
Yeah, it's a different kind of business to the entertainment business. Even to this day, I'll often tell people that can't remember an instance in my life where I ever got a job somewhere through HR, through just, submitting a resume. It's always been through people that I've worked with and who have mentioned me or hired me or whatever. And that's kind of just, it's unique to the entertainment business that people, you often just get, brought back by the same people you work with that like you and want to work with you. And that seemed to be, that was a big part of Billy's life as well.
Absolutely. Because they knew he could do the job.
Yeah.
I think that's a big part of it, right? He was professional. He was on time. He liked the work, and he didn't create distractions. He didn't have his demons at work kind of thing. So of course you want to use him again and again. That's a pattern that repeats throughout his life for sure.
Yeah. I was online looking at some videos that are still available out there that I pulled up on YouTube. I think some of them were from Retro Ontario, but him doing, sing-songy ads from way back in the day. And then, of course, the Quote 45 spots that we talked about. And he did a lot of advertising.
And his wife probably even did more. So Patty Van Ever, his second wife, like she was the queen of all those jingles. She was out there forever doing those. And Billy found a little bit more work doing other things while she was out doing that. It's just part of the hustle, right? You found these extra little pieces to work, and Billy recognized there was value to that. So that's partly why the Billy Van Singers existed. And they were like a gang for hire. And they could go over to England and work for, a couple of weeks, and their voices would be very unique on British radio or British TV.
Yeah.
So they'd get all that work over there. And the most famous gig, of course, was Spider-Man. They sang the Spider-Man theme song, Spider-Man, Spider-Man. Billy was not on that, but he was part of it, organizing it. And so his wife and his sister-in-law are both on there singing that original song.
Yeah.
And of course, I got to interview Spider-Man himself, Paul Soles, for the book. So it's like, talk about a mark out moment, getting all excited. It's like, I'm talking to Spider-Man.
Yeah. That's pretty cool. What is it that surprised you the most writing this book about Billy Van that you learned about him and his life?
I guess the biggest surprise, having read his memoir first and then sort of really diving in, was all the little shows, right? Those one-off shows, those things that never went anywhere. The pilots that you dig up that are forgotten for all time, right? And there's those in California, there's those here in Toronto, there's just all these little things. It's the what ifs, I guess, right? And the biggest what if in the whole book is that I found a couple different references where he said that he'd been offered a spot on MASH.
Right.
And imagine that, but he was tied into Sonny and Cher and he couldn't do it. Now, if he'd been on MASH, how different would his life have turned out? So
yeah, I wonder what he was.
But we
offered.
all have those what ifs, right? What if Bad Dog turned into some international superstar?
Yeah. Well, and you never know until you put yourself out there. But for sure, there are those moments where the trains miss each other in the night. I don't know if I'm mixing metaphors, but yeah. I think every entertainer has got a good story about the one that they missed.
Absolutely, yeah. No, and I have those stories too. They're just not quite as exciting. It's like book deals you didn't get or whatever, but or people you didn't get the interview that you'd exchange messages with and then they pass on or something. There's a few of those guys. I wish we'd gotten to Bob Einstein, Super Dave himself.
Yeah.
I sort of reached out and didn't get him for the book. Yeah, but I mean that's life, right? There's always going to be what ifs and things you wished you'd done.
Yeah. And Super Dave, well, he passed away probably right around the same time you were proofing the book and getting it ready to put out.
Absolutely. Yeah. He died while I was working on the book and, it's unfortunate, but that happens. Right. So.
Yeah. So this is a book about Billy Van, but also the city of Toronto is a big character in the book.
Absolutely. And I think that gets overlooked. He was a Toronto icon, right? His dad used to, work down at the old Sunnyside Pavilion and help organize the acts there. So Billy met a lot of vaudeville people and things right from the start. Then his dad ran the CNE concessions.
Yeah.
So Billy would meet some of the stars there at the CNE. The different jobs they all did, like Billy delivered milk for a while in the city, went to school there and high school and dropped out. One of the guys he went to high school with was Maurice Safer, who later went on to 60 Minutes.
Yeah. All
these kind of things. And then he just becomes part of the fabric of the city. And I love that, right? Whether it was at the CBC and being able to describe, the celebrity club where they all drank, or his house out in Scarborough and how that was a cottage back in the day.
Yeah.
You know, he had an apartment downtown, but went to the cottage, which was Scarborough.
Yeah.
So it was just such a place, you know, it was a different time for sure than it is today. And I'm not sure Billy would do very well in social media world.
Yeah. It's interesting. I got the same feeling when I was reading your book that I did not long ago when I read Robbie Robertson's book. Robbie Robertson, you know, rock legend from the band, and Robbie had lived in Scarborough and different parts of the city, and you know, they in the book they rhyme off all these different addresses in the city on Gerrard Street, and I'm trying to imagine exactly where that is. And while I was reading your book, you know, you're naming off, you know, the house on Davenport and the one out on whatever that I forget what they call that, the cliffside, because he lived right off over near the bluffs, I guess, and just rhyming off all these different addresses, and I'm trying to picture where these are, and you know, how close to some of those houses I lived close by at one point, and just thinking of all the amazing stories of people who've lived in little houses all over the city. You know, Billy Van is one of them in his family, but just so many great stories out there, you know.
And that's our job as writers to try to keep some of that alive.
Yeah.
You know, again, you wish you got more, but I was happy with what I did get. And even just little things like, you know, when you go to the Toronto Archives and you dig up a little ad for the milk company that he delivered for, right? And you throw that in there. It's just a little visual break, but it's neat, right? And in the end, you want a book to be memorable for both the text, but in this case, there were a lot of the visuals too. And we got some great photos from the families. We got some great photos from CBC. And a few other different sources. So yeah, I'm really proud of this book.
Yeah. And so this is a book too. Well, I think all of your books are like this, because especially your wrestling books. I mean, you've been writing about wrestling for a couple decades now, and your fans, so the wrestling fans are intense. They love the sport, and they love the characters. You probably get a similar response to the kind of people who would be Billy Van fans. And so now that the book's been out for a little while, have you been surprised by the reaction, or what sort of reaction do you get, or you know, how have people approached you having read the book?
It's been really neat, but it's also such a hustle too, right?
Yeah.
Because you want those people to get out there and tell other people about the book, because it's self-published. It's a whole different thing. It's not on Amazon. So you need to, you know, preach the hustle, I guess, in a way. It's for every phone call you get from the people that are in the book, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, how much they love it, and revisiting old friends, then you hear the people saying, wow, I'm just blown away about how much I learned.
Yeah.
Right. How much I learned about Billy, how much I learned about, you know, Frightenstein, which was my favorite show, how much I loved hearing from Dinah Christie, who's, you know, a Canadian gem that never gets talked about. So all these different things add up to, I'm proud of it. And it's a unique project for sure. And I'm glad we finally got around to doing it. The pandemic sort of forced our hand a little bit in that, okay, I got time, I got no excuse. So let's get it done. It was a bit of a leap of faith, but it's paying off for sure. But we have, you know, the Facebook groups and Twitter and wherever it is that people are talking about it. And that's what you want.
Yeah. 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 Well, you said you'd gotten a grant way back when. You told me that basically, this has spanned a decade from the first talk of the conception to publishing and putting it out there. And thank you for doing it. Like I said, I was a huge fan, and am a fan even more so now, Billy Van, for having read the book and learned so much more about, the kind of consummate artist he was, and all the other things that he did throughout his career to advance his career, and to put food and, in plates for his family and homes and all that kind of stuff that we all need to do. But it was really interesting to read, about the fuller story of Billy Van, not just the guy who played those 8 crazy characters on that show that I used to watch for a brief period in the 1970s as a kid. So thanks for that. And it was really a great read, and I enjoyed it very much. So thank you for sharing Billy's story with us.
Cool. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it, David, and that's the goal, right? I think you get a different vibe just because you're an actor, as we said off from the outset, that you're getting little things out of it that maybe your average fan isn't. But that's I love that challenge to entertain different levels of people. My father-in-law couldn't get through it; he found it a little boring. Oh well, he's 82. He's not maybe going to enjoy it the way those of us who love this guy do.
Yeah. You're working on a next project now, or have you always got one or two in the hopper?
The big thing right now is the hustle. It's billyvan.ca to get the book.
Mhm.
But there is another book coming out. It should be March. It's from ECW Press. And it's this fascinating tale about this guy who was involved in wrestling, baseball, and country music. And the short version is, he was a wrestling fan, started a wrestling radio show in the 70s.
Yeah.
Went to school for journalism, decided he wanted to get involved in baseball, was in minor league baseball, went to the bar, saw a fabulous singer, decided to be a music manager.
Yeah.
And that turned out to be Patty Loveless, who's a country music superstar.
Yeah.
So he ends up trying to work in the music business for years, goes back to wrestling, then walks away from wrestling and is in country music for 20 years, as an executive in different ways.
Right.
So I needed challenges. Didn't really want to do the wrestling side of things, but it's everything else that I learned about, right? It was fascinating learning about country music. It was fascinating learning about minor league baseball. And his two of his roommates were J.P. Riccardi and John Gibbon.
Right.
So, talk about a tie into Toronto right there.
Yeah.
The former general manager. So that's coming out in March, late March, early April. And then after that, it's a little bit of a hiatus. I'm not exactly sure what's next. I'm working with a couple of people on other projects, like a documentary, things like that. You just don't know what's next. And part of the fun, I guess.
Yeah. But you're constantly still writing about wrestling though, right?
Yeah. So I still run the slamwrestling.net website, which started in late 1996. Not a lot of websites have been around that long.
Yeah.
Let alone producing top-notch content like we've done. So it's been a lot of fun and it keeps me involved with today's scene, I guess. And like we talked about with Billy, I'm mentoring young writers.
Yeah. Right.
So we might have somebody who's 20 years old and is real enthusiastic about wrestling, and they need a little bit of guidance. So I'm there to help, and that refreshes me in a different way.
In the grand scheme of things, you've written and curated a lot of the stories about professional wrestling. And when people look back and whatever, Google in the future, whatever people are using to source all that material, your name is going to come up again and again and again and again and again. That's pretty cool.
It is really cool. And we had to deal with post media, and we got cut from there in the early days of COVID. Mm-hmm. And so we have to set out on our own. But the good thing is a lot of that's coming back, right? Google still likes us and recognizes quality of work and references from other people. So we've been rebuilding a lot, but you're right. It's all out there. We've done more documenting of pro wrestling maybe than just about any other site out there. And it's not just the big names, it's the little names, right?
Yeah.
Like for every Mad Dog Vachon, which is awesome, you can talk to the knockoff Butcher Vachon that they used to have out in the Maritimes, who wasn't related at all. So, there's just stories everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. So now if people want to pick up a copy of Who's the Man, Billy Van, they can go to oliverbooks.ca. And then you mentioned there's a billyvan.ca.
Oliverbooks.ca or just billyvan.ca.
And they can order a hard copy and have it sent to them ASAP.
Something like that. Yeah. Down the road, we'll probably do the proper ebook. But, for now, there was 1,000 books in my garage, but there's not anymore, thankfully. They continue to go out the door regularly, and I appreciate that there's so many Billy Van fans out there that want to learn more about him. Yeah,
well, I would encourage anybody who's a Billy Van fan or just interested in reading about sort of old time Hollywood or vaudeville days and sort of old showbiz and how fascinating that was to pick up a copy. Like I said, it was a great read and I really enjoyed it. And I think others will. So they should go check that out.
I appreciate the praise. Thanks, David.
Greg, it was wonderful talking to you. Hopefully it doesn't take us another 17 years before we do this again. But thank you very much for your time. It was fantastic chatting with you.
Cool. All right. Thanks for all the time, David. Have a great one.
All right. All the best. There you have it, my conversation with Greg Oliver. Be sure to visit oliverbooks.ca to pick up your copy of Who's the Man, Billy Van. Also, while we're talking business, just wanted to put it out to you that one way you can help me reach more potential listeners is by taking a minute or two to leave a comment or review in the appropriate section wherever you stream the podcast. If you do so, I would be more than happy to feature your comments in an upcoming episode. Furthermore, if you would like to support the show, you can do so by making a small monthly pledge by visiting patreon.com/coolstory with David J. MacNeil. Patreon being spelt Patreon. Your support would be greatly appreciated. Also, thanks again to Mr. Jerry Stamp, who wrote and performed the Cool Story theme song and all other jingles and stings that appear on the show. Do yourselves a favor and look for Jerry's music wherever you stream. And finally, thank you for listening. Until next time, pura vida.
Everybody's had some adventures. Everybody's had a few close calls. Everybody's got a story. What's yours?